The scene opens in Paris, where an anti-drug squad is raiding an apartment. The officers arrest the man in the apartment for keeping and selling drugs. The scene then shifts to a man named Richard Malinowski, who is a police inspector, and today he is taking his 10-year-old daughter Emily out on a cycling trip. He calls her anesthesiologist wife, Claire, and tells her that he is going out with Emily and will be back soon. Just before the father and daughter were about to leave, Richard gets a call from the guy who earlier got arrested by the anti-drug squad. The man is a friend of Richard and he asks him for help. Richard agrees after thinking for a few seconds, and Emily realizes that their trip will be cancelled now. She angrily returns to her room, so Richard tries to calm her down and promises that he will be back soon. Richard leaves and Emily begins chatting with her friend on the computer. She tells her friend that her dad just left, and her friend asks if they can meet in the nearby woods. She agrees and leaves on her cycle. Meanwhile, Richard reaches the police station and somehow frees his friend from custody. He drops the man home and then heads to his house, where he finds Emily missing. Richard starts getting worried and calls Claire to inform her that he is going out to look for Emily. Just then, he receives a call from his colleague Stephen, who tells him that they found the dead body of a 10-year-old girl in the woods. Richard immediately rushes to the location, hoping it's not Emily's. Unfortunately, the dead girl is Emily, and Richard breaks down on the spot, devastated by his loss. The scene then shifts to the funeral of Emily, where the director of police and other colleagues of Richard arrive. The director is informed that Emily was molested before her death. The director orders Stephen and others to solve the case as soon as possible. With a heavy heart, Richard and Claire say goodbye to their daughter and close the casket. Soon after, Officer Stephen is successful in catching a suspect named Daniel Ekman. When Emily's friend is questioned, he reveals that he and Emily parted ways after they had an argument. Stephen informs his boss Arnold that there is no forensic evidence against Daniel, but he is sure he is the killer, and if they beat him enough, he'll confess. During Daniel's interrogation, Richard barges into the room and aims a gun at Daniel to shoot him. The other officers somehow stop Richard and calm him down, while Daniel pisses his pants, witnessing Richard's anger. After some time, Daniel confesses to the crime and gives certain details that only the killer would know, though there is still no forensic evidence against him. A year passes, and today is the day of judgment. Daniel retracts his claim in front of the judge, saying that the police forced the confession out of him. His lawyer argues that the police officers are friends with Richard, who's the father of the victim. However, the jury and the judge hold Daniel accountable for the crime, and he is sentenced to 30 years in prison. After the judgment, Stephen drops Richard and Claire home and tells his friend that he has been transported to Bordeaux. The two friends bid farewell, and the scene ends there. In prison, Daniel writes a letter for Richard, but after contemplating it for a while, he hides it in the curtain rod of his cell. He then writes another letter to Richard, where he sympathizes with him and also claims his innocence. Richard breaks down reading the letter and regrets the decision of leaving Emily alone that day. 1 year passes by, and Richard still hasn't recovered from his loss. He has started drinking, and Claire is going through a similar situation of regret and grief. On Emily's death anniversary, Richard goes through the events of that day like he didn't leave Emily alone. Overwhelmed with grief, Richard cries in Emily's room. On the other hand, Daniel is still writing letters to Richard, claiming his innocence and urging him to catch the real killer. He is also talking to a bunch of girls who apparently became fans of him as they believe he is innocent. Richard has never written back to Daniel, but he still reads all the letters and keeps them safe in his drawer. One day, Richard was listening to the radio when he learns about a serial killer named Salinas, who got caught by the police in Bordeaux. Salinas also has a history of killing children, so Richard begins thinking if he's the real murderer of Emily. Keeping this in mind, Richard meets his boss Arnold and asks if he can go to Bordeaux to investigate Salinas's case. Arnold agrees, and Richard immediately goes to Bordeaux, where he meets up with his friend Stephen. Stephen gives him all the files of Salinas's case. Richard begins analyzing the case and tries to find similarities between Salinas's victims and Emily's murder. Meanwhile, Daniel keeps writing back and forth to his female supporters, who are now eagerly trying to free him. Richard finishes his investigation in Bordeaux and returns to Paris. He explains to Arnold that all the murders committed by Salinas were done across one railway line, which happens to be near the woods where Emily's body was found. Moreover, Emily was killed the same way Salinas's other victims were killed. He has also found the address of Salinas's cousin, which is only 15 kilometers away from the crime scene. Though hesitant, Arnold lets Richard go to the address to investigate. There he finds the cousin and asks her about Salinas's location on the day of the murder. She says she doesn't remember the exact place where Salinas might have been, but he used to regularly go to a doctor for his migraine. She gives Richard a receipt from that doctor. Richard then calls Stephen and asks him to present Salinas before a judge again, so the judge can ask him if he committed Emily's murder too. At first, Stephen says it's not possible, but Richard blackmails him about their friendship and somehow convinces him. Salinas is presented before the judge again, and she shows him a photo of Emily, asking if he murdered her too. Salinas says that though he was near the woods that day, he has nothing to do with the murder. On the other hand, Richard returns home and writes a letter to Daniel. He tells him about Salinas, who is probably the real murderer of Emily, and therefore he will try his best to free an innocent man. Daniel reads Richard's letter and breathes a great sigh of relief. He then looks at the letters of his female supporters and selects one who seems most supportive. He decides to ask her for help and writes a letter for her. However, he didn't want to send the letter through the usual mail as guards often read them, so Daniel meets up with his lawyer and tells him that he has written a special letter to his love interest. His lawyer believes him and agrees to deliver the letter. Richard then follows the address on receipt and meets Salinas' doctor at the time. The doctor checks the receipt and says he remembers Salinas. Salinas was suffering from severe migraines after his mother's death, and he was treating him. Richard says he is suspicious that Salinas molested and killed Emily, but the doctor says it's not possible. The doctor takes Richard inside to tell him exactly why, and the scene ends there. Later, Richard meets up with a reporter and asks for her help. He wants her to publish all the evidence he has against Salinas. In the next scene, Richard and Claire are having dinner when the news reporter shows new findings about the Emily case. Seeing Richard in the news, Claire questions why he didn't tell her anything, but Richard stays silent. In the office, Arnold too gets angry at Richard for proving his colleagues wrong, but he is unaffected again. It appears that Richard is willing to go to any extent to prove that Daniel is innocent. Just then, Arnold receives a call and gets to know that a new eyewitness has come forward in the case. The eyewitness is a woman, Christiana, claiming she saw Salinas near the woods that day. Actually, Daniel has sent this woman so he can be proven innocent. The woman's made-up story will be heard in the court, and there's no way to disprove it. Arnold does some background research on her but finds no criminal record. Richard asks Arnold to put Daniel through a retrial, but he gets angry and refuses. Realizing that Arnold won't help him, Richard writes to Daniel and tells him to plead for a retrial via his lawyer. One day, Claire was going through Richard's desk when she comes across all the letters from Daniel. She gets extremely angry at Richard for talking to Emily's killer and asks why is he doing all this. Richard again stays silent, and Claire can't take this anymore, so she storms out of the place to live with her mother. Then on the day of the trial, Richard goes to speak in the favor of Daniel. Christiana too gives her statement, making Salinas' case extremely weak. Salinas says that he has already confessed to all the murders he committed, but Emily is not one of them. The judge and jury give Daniel the benefit of doubt, and he is declared innocent. Daniel is overjoyed to hear the decision, and then we directly see him packing his things. There he takes out the letter he hid in the curtain rod, and we finally gets to see its content. In that letter, Daniel confessed to killing his first victim when he was 20. After that, he killed many women and children, and Emily was his last victim. Being free now, Daniel eats the letter so the truth can remain forever hidden. Daniel then gives an interview to a news channel and reveals how he lost 3 years of his life because of a false accusation. He then meets up with Christina and tells him that he is leaving the city to start a new life. When he kisses Christina to bid farewell, she realizes through his odd behavior that he might not be innocent after all. Daniel then calls his lawyer and asks him for Richard's number as he wants to meet him one last time before leaving. He calls Richard and asks him to meet for once. Richard invites him to his home, and there he offers Daniel a drink. Daniel requests to see Emily's room as there's something he needs to see. Daniel was about to reveal the truth when he suddenly goes unconscious. Actually, this was because Richard put sedatives in his drink. When Daniel opens his eyes, he finds himself completely tied and at the same place where he killed Emily. Turns out, all of this was a plan from Richard so he can avenge his daughter. Richard says that when Emily died, he promised himself that he would kill the killer, and had he waited for 30 for Daniel to be free, his anger probably would have been anguished by then. So he devised this master plan, and now he will finish him off with his own hands. Richard pushes Daniel into the grave he dug up and buries him alive. Soon after, Daniel is declared missing in the news, and his lawyers gives the statement that he fled the city due to societal pressure. At the end of the movie, Richard was standing by Emily's grave when Arnold approaches him and says he knows the truth. Salinas' doctor told him that due to Salinas' medical condition, it was impossible for him to physically molest someone. Arnold tells Richard that he could be hanged for such a strategic crime, but Richard replies that he died the very day Emily's dead body was found.